y también a ustedes por pues, estar presentes. Es un evento en conjunto con la Universidad de Cartagena, la Asociación Colombiana de Historia Económica y la Red de Investigadores del Banco de la República. El profesor Guido Alfani es profesor de la Universidad de Historia Económica. Sus intereses sobre todo son la movilidad social desde la era preindustrial, ha trabajado cosas también de la antigüedad, trabaja desigualdad económica, desigualdad social, es un demógrafo también, ha trabajado el efecto de las crisis, de las guerras y de las pandemias, los efectos económicos, y hoy nos va a presentar un libro sobre las élites en Occidente, una visión de largo plazo. Vamos a dejar más o menos unos 45 minutos de presentación y al final sería ideal que ustedes hicieran preguntas. Se las pueden hacer en español, tal vez respondan en español o en inglés. Vamos a ver cómo hacemos eso, pero bueno, bienvenidos a participar y Guido, gracias de nuevo por estar acá.
Gracias, muchas gracias Juliana por esta presentación y muchas gracias a todos los colegas por haberme invitado aquí. Está verdaderamente en inglés. A pleasure to be here. So I'm sorry my presentation is in English. I will be able hopefully to answer questions in Spanish later. As Juliana mentioned, I'm presenting you this book, which is about the rich in the West, in the long run of history. The book covers mostly the last 1,000 years, so beginning with the so-called commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th century, which happened in the Mediterranean area mostly, and sometimes going back to even classical antiquity. But the idea is really to focus on long-run dynamics. The book is divided in 3 parts. The first is about how we can define wealth and how rich were the rich in the past. The second is about which were the main paths to become rich, wealthy in history. And finally, a substantial final part is about the role played by the rich in society. By the way, if I talk too much, you'll warn me, okay? Give me like, tell me I have 10 minutes left, something like that. So I will tell you a little about this first part and something more about the other 2. What I will tell you, and what I will begin with, is a general impression of wealth inequality and the concentration of wealth at the very top of society across history. Beginning with the pre-industrial period. For Europe, we can sometimes go back, based on the documents we have, to the very beginning of the 14th century, to just before the Black Death pandemic, which began in 1347, and which killed about half the people of Europe and the Mediterranean. And then we can continue up until the very end of the early modern period. We can do this for some areas only, we can do this for partly for England, and we can do this for many different parts of Italy. There is still much work going on, but the general impression we get from the regions of Europe which we have been able to explore, and by the way, this is the wealth share of the richest 5%, which is one among different definitions of the wealthy which I use, right? So, the general impression we get is that from the very end of the Middle Ages till the end of the early modern period, the wealth share for the top 5% increased continuously. If we expand this to the previous period, we find that the Black Death epidemic was an event able to trigger a long phase of inequality reduction. Now, the main exception we know about this general story is that of Germany, which basically follows, and that's the green line, sorry, yes, it's the green line here, it follows exactly the same path as the others, except for the 17th century, when there is a second phase of inequality decline in Germany, triggered by the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which was the most destructive war of pre-industrial Europe, plus the 1620s. And this was a catastrophe enough to trigger this second phase of inequality reduction. Now, this graph ends at 1800, If we move forward, and in this case we can relatively say something also about the United States. We have some information from the very end of the colonial period of the United States. We observe a continued inequality growth, again, wealth, and by the way, this is the top 1% instead. When we think about wealth shares, I use two main definitions, the top 5% and the top 1%, right? And sometimes I have to look at even smaller percentiles because we don't have information about other status of society. And these definitions are the two most popular ones in the literature, but they're not without issues, as I will explain later. Anyway, inequality growth till the beginning of World War I, and then a second phase of inequality decline, lasting until the early 1970s. The first phase of this decline is usually considered to be connected to the impact, the direct impact of the world wars. The examples you have on this graph are those of France, Sweden, and the United States. And the second, however, after the end of World War II, is usually connected to the development of the welfare state systems and to very substantial fiscal redistribution. Now, this general story is correct if we don't forget about the fact that the development of very progressive taxation of pretty much everything, wealth, income, inheritances, begins in the World War period. Right? It was also part of the social contract which was set up to allow the states to fight the war. So you imagine World War I, you have to send people to the trenches, right? In the terms of, for example, the right to vote in elections, but also substantial to be sent to the front, also capital had to be paid for the war. We have this well-known resumption of the tendency for wealth inequality and income inequality, by the way, to grow again, which is a general process across Western societies. I don't have the time to talk to you about this, but this is also connected to changes in fiscal taxes across the West. If we bring everything together, and this is like the last 700 years, again, wealth share of the 1%, we have really this impression, which is somehow depressing to me, that the long-run tendency for wealth inequality has been growth. So wealth has tended to become ever more concentrated in few hands, and the only two phases in which this process was interrupted were triggered by large-scale catastrophe. Now, this is basically, correct, but if we put too much of this as a kind of unnatural process, a natural tendency for inequality to grow, and unfortunately, as only catastrophes can reduce it, we could think, okay, so we have to live with that because the cure is worth the illness. Fact is, history also suggests that a lot of this story depends on choice, so on principle we could choose different. Anyway, this is kind of beyond the scope of my presentation. A problem we have when we define the rich based on top wealth shares is that we are basically implying that across time, and across societies, the rich are a fixed percentage of society. If we focus on the share of the top 5%, it's always, the top 5% of the rich is 5% of the people. How can we go beyond this? Well, one way of doing this is to define the rich in a relative way. In this case, those who were below, so were above 10 times the median value. If you do this, and interesting enough, we can do this for pre-industrial societies, at least those which I've studied in my projects, because we focus on the complete distribution, but we don't have the data to do this for modern societies, right? So if we do this for the periods and areas where we can do it, we find that the prevalence of the rich, those who are above 10%, 10 times the median value, increases from the beginning of the early modern period till the end of the early modern times. The exception is again that of Germany. And again, if you look at the earlier periods, the Black Death seems to have reduced a bit the privilege of the rich. So this tells you that in the early modern times, at the same time, we have that the richest are growing richer in terms of their wealth share, and the rich are becoming more abundant, right? So you have more people who are way above the middling and lower levels of society. Now, moving to the second part, and here I will tell you something more really. If we have to think about the main paths to affluence across history, I think that three really have to be highlighted. One is that of nobility/aristocracy. The second is entrepreneurship and innovation, and from these I distinguish that of finance. Of course, there were also other paths to affluence, for example, exercising a liberal profession, even in a pre-industrial context. The fact of being, for example, a lawyer or a doctor was a path to wealth. But in general, I think that these are the most important ones to focus on, both in terms of their, significance, in terms of how many people were becoming rich in this way, and also in terms of how this shapes our understanding of the rich and wealth across history. Now, if we begin with the path of nobility, I usually show this slide without names. I always ask if you can identify any of these three people. One of them, the middle one, he is also relevant to colonial history there. So not Colombian history, as far as I know. This is a bit of a difficult start, I know. So, this guy here, Alan the Red, followed William the Conqueror in the 11th century in England. So he joined William during the conquest of England. He fought with him at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. He remained in England instead of going back to Normandy, as many of those who followed William. Now, he was really a minor noble, like I think it was the sixth son of an earl of Normandy, and he clearly remaining in Normandy wouldn't have had access to any substantial resources, but he remained in England, and he also developed a useful specialty, which was that of quenching rebellions. And thanks to this, service paid to the king, he was given most of the lands of the rebels, and he became extremely wealthy. There is a somehow funny statistic which looks at the share of the total product of England to command. And based on these statistics, he might have been the richest person ever to live in Britain, right? If you don't consider kids. So he basically made his wealth, and he was born a noble. Now, one big problem with nobility is, first, how to acquire it, and second, whether you made the wealth of the family or you inherited it. The second guy here, Antoine II Crozat, he wasn't born a noble. Actually, his father, Antoine I, had tried to follow a path towards becoming a noble, but he didn't go beyond marrying a noble woman. And the family specialty originally was collecting taxes for the king. Antoine II Crozat, at the end of the 11th century, became the general tax collector of the King of France, Louis XIV. And this proximity to the king also gave him access to additional opportunities. He actually was given the monopoly of the slave trade with the Spanish colonies. And in 1712, he was also given the monopoly of the Louisiana trade, right? And he set up the Louisiana company. Might have been the richest person in France, and Voltaire called him Crésus, from Crésus, the ancient king of India and super rich person. But importantly for what I want to tell you is that he was trying hard to push the king, Louis XIV, to make him a noble, and he succeeded. The king made him a noble, and the point is, why did he want to become a noble? Why all this fuss? Also because the old nobility was looking down on him as kind of a parvenu. And the point is, we find across the early modern period and well into the 19th century, actually to the very end of the 19th century, the people who made their fortunes in trade or entrepreneurship very often wanted to become a noble because they knew that this gave them access to additional opportunities. Being close to the court was an opportunity. It was an opportunity for this guy here. It was an opportunity for those who were seeking nobility, say, in the context of Imperial Germany at the end of the 90s. His children were the first, however, in the family who actually were considered by the other nobles to be real nobles. They were perfectly integrated in the top nobility of France. He, of course, also made the wealth of the family. The last person here is Duke Grosvenor, the current Duke of Westminster. His family is the recent nobility by British standards because they became nobles only in the 17th century. And the fortune of the family depends on the fact that at some point they acquired lands around, close to London, which were swamps at the time, but today are some of the richest neighborhoods of London itself. So simply by owning it and inheriting it, he made the really top 10 list of the richest persons in England, and this family is always present in the news. And this is a general problem we have with nobility, because nobility allows us to focus the attention on inherited wealth. And inherited wealth in Western culture is somehow considered today, not in the past, but today, less legitimate compared to wealth made to, for example, entrepreneurship. Now, I'll be talking about the nobility, which is distinguished, if we look at the sociological definition of nobility, which basically was introduced by the famous sociologist Max Weber, by having formal titles of nobility which are transferred from one generation to the other. But aristocracy is a different concept, which doesn't require formal titles of nobility, but only some sort of privilege, the enjoyment of some sort of privilege. And this is why we can, for example, talk about the development of a wealth aristocracy in the United States in the 19th century, right? And this is why there is today a concern about the possible development of a global aristocracy. So people who, across the world, move to attend the same schools, develop similar tastes, play the same, exercise same sports, have shared experiences. And the problem here is that as aristocracy is defined on privilege, it's also defined by exclusion, because you can't share a privilege too much, too widely, otherwise it's going to be no privilege at all, right? So the problem here is that this might lead to the closing of the top, or if you want, to declining mobility, at least at the very top of society. Now, I don't have time to go into detail about all these things, but these are a couple of things which we have to focus on if we think about this way to become rich, which usually, but not always, has to do with inheriting wealth. Now, if we move to entrepreneurship and innovation, this is the path to affluence that today we think of as the most legitimate, but not in the past. I will tell you later, in the Middle Ages, this was the path to affluence which came to the biggest problems. Recognize any of these people, well, one is very easy. Bill Gates. The others are harder. I very rarely have luck, since that very rarely happen that people identify any of these. Anyway, to the top right we have Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the water frame, which was one of the key inventions in the British Industrial Revolution. It was used to produce cotton thread, basically. And it's kind of a good example of how to become wealthy during this phase of explorations of the economy, the first industrial revolution. Then we have, to the left, Francesco Di Marco da Tilly. This is a very nice case. This guy was an Italian merchant from the 14th century. He was made an orphan by the Black Death. His family was of middling groups. He became an orphan because of the Black Death. His parents and his brothers died. He inherited something. He sold everything. And when he was like 16, he moved to Avignon in France, which at the time hosted the court of the Pope. and started trading between France and Italy. And he became an exceptionally successful trader, one of the main merchants of 14th century Europe. And we know everything about this guy because his complete business and personal archive was found at the end of they basically hidden at the end of a staircase in his palace in Prato, in Tuscany, at the end of the 90s. So we know everything about this. I will tell you more later because in his old age he also decided to become a banker, which led to something. The second guy here is young Peter von Kuhn, who in 1612 became the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company. And usually I take this guy to highlight two things. First, how the beginning of the age of explorations, the beginning of the Atlantic trade also offered many opportunities to become wealthy, and also to highlight kind of the dark side of innovation, right? Because this guy here, even by the very low standards of the time, was treating people in the colonies very poorly. There is this famous episode in the Banda Islands, which was the place of production of the nutmegs, and the indigenous people had an agreement with the Dutch, which the Dutch understood as, having a monopoly on the nutmegs, but the natives understood differently. They also wanted to trade with the English. It didn't work for these guys. So the solution was to conquer the Banda Islands, exterminate the population, bring away the survivors, who will move to Java, Indonesia, and repopulate them with slaves brought from Africa, which were supposed to be easier to conquer. Now, in the book, I also make other examples of this kind of exploitation, or if you want, the kind of dark side. People like Pizarro, as you surely know, among many other things, asked for this exceptional ransom when he captured Atahualpa, the emperor of the Inca Empire. It was like 85 cubic meters of gold, if I remember correctly. And of course, somebody who also is connected to the history of Cartagena, if I'm not wrong, Sir Francis Drake, who basically was a pirate, right? And piracy is another way of exploiting the opportunities of the Atlantic trade. And in general, we have that entrepreneurship can also be, also has a dark side. Organized crime is an aspect of it as well. Now, good. Okay. Now, also in the case of entrepreneurship, we have some other problems which we might want to discuss. One is that becoming rich in this way has not been equally easy across history. So we can try and identify phases during which becoming wealthy through innovation has been relatively easy. One such phase was the immediate post-Black period, so from the second half of the 14th century. So for about a century, this terrible pandemic opened opportunities for the survivors. Another was the first phase of the opening of the Atlantic trade routes. Then we have the Industrial Revolution. Then we have at least the beginning of the computer and information. But then, this connects this path to affluence or mobility. We have the problem that if you observe the first generations and then the second, third, and fourth generations, there is a difference, because there is a difference between those who made their wealth and those who mostly inherited it. So the point is that new wealth always tends to become old across time. And the point is that we have in these phases the establishment of wealth dynasties. And then an open question here, because I say open question because we don't have enough information to answer it properly. But it's important to ask this question. The open question is whether the process of establishment of wealth dynasty, or if you want, the aristocratization of wealth in these phases, in the end, brings these phases of relatively easy enrichment to an end. This seems to have happened at the end of the Industrial Revolution. it seems that, for example, in the context of the United States, at the end of the Gilded Age, the group which was at the top was actively trying to keep the newcomers down. Then, of course, in that case, we have that the world wars make everything confused. But, this is a question important to ask, because we might be experiencing this right now without noticing it. Most of the people who became super rich during the computer and information age are pretty old today, people like Bill Gates. And the way in which their companies behave is also to try and prevent newcomers don't to become too big, so they simply buy them off. So, this is something that on principle could also connect to some human qualities. Now, finally, finance. Finance is very difficult to distinguish from entrepreneurship and, even from trade in a medieval and early modern context, of course. But it's important to try and do that because this is, across Western history, the path of affluence which has led to the greatest problems and which has been looked at with the greatest suspicion. So I mentioned this guy here, Francesco di Marco Latini, and I told you we know everything about him. Now, when he was pretty old, at the end of the 14th century, he decided he also wanted to open a bank. And then he sent to his business associates his letters telling them, look, I want to open a bank or a bank. What do you think about that? And we have the answers. And his friends were telling me, why in hell do you want to do it? I mean, you are already one of the richest people in Florence and then in Europe at the time. You have a very good name as a merchant. If you become a money changer, a banker, in the worst material, everybody will think that you're a usurer. I, who am your friend, know that you wouldn't, and you would instead, be a good person, whatever. But they will say there is no way he's not a usurer because all those who play with money are usurers. But the point was, even if it was entirely acceptable according to the law in that period to be involved in credit, in private credit, this was still considered as a big problem. And this stigma involving finance weakens in history, but it survives in some form until today. Think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example. Right? Now, I could make you other examples of how to become rich following the path to affluence, like Cosimo de' Medici, we'll mention him later, or Jacob Fugger, he was the banker of the Emperor Charles V. I will mention it to John Pierpont Morgan. I will tell you something more about Grazia Nasi, because I want to tell you something about at least one woman. And what we have with women is that usually they are, we know that many among them were very much involved in managing the family company, but we usually don't know about that because they are hidden by the surviving documentation. In exceptional cases, like for example that of Francesco di Marco Latini, we know that his wife, Margherita, was basically managing the company when he was, say, in the Low Countries for his work, right? So we know about that, but that's because for entirely exceptional reasons, we know everything about that guy. Now, Grazia Nasi is a very interesting case, which also allows to highlight an interesting feature of finance. Again, we kind of look down on finance as a way to become wealthy, but for women, it was a relatively open area of activity. In Europe, in pre-industrial Europe, and sometimes also in the 19th century, women had legal constraints to their capacity to act in the economy. In the context of finance, they were rare. Many among them were actually widows, so they became free when they became widows, right? And they could invest their capital. And we know that women were very important in terms of lenders, maybe to an intermediary, but we know that many of them were actually making their decisions in pretty every European context we know about, or say in the United States in the 19th century, in the early 20th. They were a very substantial part of those providing money, and they controlled a very substantial part of total capital being loaned. Now, Grazia Nasi is a very interesting case. She was born in 1510 She belonged to a family of Marranos, so these were Jews converted to the Christian religion. She was made to marry her uncle, Francisco Mendes, and the Mendes family happened to have been one of the main funders of the Portuguese project to open the trade route to the Indies, the East Indies, by circumnavigating Africa. And by the beginning of the 16th century, the Mendes family, beyond being very important financial players, also controlled a substantial part of the import of pepper to Europe. They were extremely rich. Her husband dies in 1538, and so she becomes a super rich widow. And a Marrana on top. 2 years before, the Portuguese Inquisition had been established. And she perceived the situation as being dangerous, not only because she belonged to a family of converted Jews, but also because she really didn't want to be forced to marry somebody she didn't want to marry. So what she does is leave Lisbon and move to Antwerp to join the brother of her deceased husband, Jogo Mendes. And we know that she helped Jogo to manage the family firm. By the way, Jogo later married her daughter, so the family was very closely knitted together. On top of that, in his will, Jogo established that upon his death, she had to become the manager of the entire Mendes firm, which she does. So he dies, and she becomes the manager. Problem, however, she's even richer, and again, a widow without any man who could kind of shelter. And the problem here is again, Charles V, the emperor, who really wants to ease the marriage between her and the minor member of the House of Aragon, who happened to have promised 100,000 ducats to the emperor in case the matchmaking was successful. Right. So what she does is to flee with subterfuge. She flees first to Aachen, saying that she's going to the Terns, and then she goes to Lyon, and then she ends up in Italy, in particular in Ferrara, which at that moment was, for the Jewish community, one of the most open places in Europe. Problem is, there she resumes open practice of the Jewish religion. And that becomes an issue because that was illegal, that was apostasy. You couldn't abandon the Christian religion. Right? And even in Ferrara that was a problem, so she has to flee again. She flees to Istanbul, which in that period was even more open religiously than a place like Ferrara in Italy. And from Istanbul, at the court of the Sultan, she helps Jews escape persecution across Europe using the connections and the money of her family. And again, it is a very interesting case. Of course, it's an exceptional case, but it allows to illuminate, to highlight this other side to finance, right? Now, we can also try to measure in a quantitative way how important these different paths to affluence were. For the pre-industrial period, we can do this only for a few places, actually, like the city of Verona, where we have fiscal records that exceptionally also tell us about the occupation of the people, of the taxpayers. Now, in this case, as we have the complete population, we can also look at what happens if we apply different definition of wealth, like, what happens if we look at the composition of top 5 or top 1, or of those who are above the richness line, so above 10 times the median wealth, which in this case, in this specific case, is an in-between situation in terms of the prevalence between top 5 and top 1. And we see, for example, that in this place, finance was almost unimportant, but Verona was not a financial hub. And we have some sign that from the beginning of this period, so 1409 to the beginning of the 17th century, due to the progressive decline of certain manufacturing activities, especially in the textile sector within the city of Verona proper, the prevalence of those practicing, of those becoming wealthy through entrepreneurship and trade was declining. Anyway, we can do this exercise for some communities and places. When we get into the modern period, we have to rely on the so-called rich list, right? Like the Forbes list of billionaires of today. For the previous period, and in particular for Britain and the United States, we have some other rich lists. I will show you the case of the United States, highlighting a couple of things. First, if you look at the richest Americans, and by the way, these are very small percentages of it. So in this case, we are looking at the top 0.001% to 0.0001%. So it's really the top of the top. And what you see here, where is interesting, you see the decline from those born before 1830 to those born at the beginning of the 20th century, of those who had, or those whose wealth was basically connected to land and real estate. So at the beginning of the period, this is the old wealth coming from the colonial period, basically. At the same time, we observe an increase in those whose wealth comes from industry and business, and to some degree from finance. Importantly, we have also some indication about the prevalence of those who were first-generation wealth. And this declines across the period, and particularly important what happens during the Gilded Age, right? So we see exactly what I was discussing before, the aristocratization of wealth in the American Gilded Age, which means, again, that most of these people who might have really wanted to present themselves as people who had earned their position actually had inherited. Now, to be quick, if we move into the 21st century, we can look at the rich across the West. The percentage of population, these are the billionaires according to the billionaires in dollars, in US dollars, according to Forbes. The percentage is about the same, so it goes 0.001 to 0.0001% of the Western population. And we see a number of interesting things. One is that finance today is much more important in terms of how many people they can reach through it than at any previous point in history. And as I mentioned, this is only the very top, but we have some confirmation of this from other sources which tell us something about the lower groups, right? If we look at the rich defined in a broader sense, like the top 1 to 5, we continue to see that finance today really is much more important as a path to affluence, which can be a problem because there continues to be some sort of a stigma against those who made their money by using money. Those who inherited wealth are about, in the most recent years, 1/3 of the total, which is substantial. And we also know the prevalence of women within this very elite. Now, if we look at the data about women, if we try hard, very hard, we could look at the glass as being half full, because it almost doubles between 2001 and 2021. But if you consider that 13.7% is not even half those who inherited the wealth, it's pretty clear that there continues to be a substantial discrimination against women, at least at this very high level. It's not them, in many settings, who inherit, right? They are not preferred. They are disadvantaged compared to sons in many contexts. And of course, there is only so much we can do with this kind of data. Unfortunately, and this is an interesting feature of modern societies, as most countries do not systematically tax wealth, we know less about the wealthy today than about the wealth in the pre-industrial context, when wealth was the main item of taxation. We know much more about the incomes of modern people compared to the pre-industrial people, but we also know much less about the wealth of modern people compared to the pre-industrial. Really, and this actually depends on how fiscal systems are structured, which shapes how documentation is produced, the information is produced. Now, if we look a bit more about inherited wealth, the problem is that based on current estimates, we see exactly the same pattern which I described for wealth concentration. A decline in the prevalence of inherited wealth from the beginning of World War I, which was also due to the destruction of wealth caused by the World Wars, both physical destruction of wealth in the European context, especially in World War II, the destruction of financial capital, also due to war, hyperinflation, in, from the beginning of World War I and in the book figure and so on. But also here, this was the consequence of sometimes very aggressive policies against inherited wealth. And by the way, this was an effort which was relatively bipartisan in this context. In the United Kingdom, a conservative politician like Winston Churchill said that it was important to tax inheritance in order to get rid of a class of idle rich. And he said we have to do this to protect capitalism. And the problem was we have to protect capitalism from socialism. So there was an ideological competition which also kind of fostered this attempt, right? So here it's not only the extraction of wealth, it's also fiscal redistribution to substantial degree. And then we have the inversion, and the problem today is that inherited wealth has become, again, a very important and growing part of private wealth, which is one of the points that people like Martin Petit highlight as being potentially a problem for. How much for the future? How much time I have left? Okay. Now, I try to be very quick about this final point. What about the presence of the super rich in particular in society? Now, I usually read these two texts and ask people if they can identify who they are. I will not today, for reasons of time. Both of these people talk about democracies, and both of them argue that in a democratic context, if you have super rich individuals, you can't expect them to act as the others. So the point is, institutions will not work in practice in a way which gives everybody equal rights. The problem is, the first guy is Nicolas Oresme, writing in the 14th century, translating and adapting Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who already had similar concepts. And he basically says, in a city governed democratically, you should punish the wealthy. Otherwise, they will be as gods among men. You can't expect them, you can't expect a democracy to function. Of course, he was thinking about very small republics like city-states, right? And he even argued that if you really wanted to live in a democracy, maybe you should have introduced good laws to prevent people from inheriting beyond a certain amount, like 100% inheritance tax above a certain level. The other guy, of course, is Piketty, who argues that, again, if wealth concentration becomes high, you can't expect democracy to function according to the principle that they, in theory, should put forward. Now, this has to do with one specific problem, the political activity of the super rich, which has always been considered a problem in Western history. But the presence of very wealthy people in society is a much more general problem. So in the Middle Ages, theologians argued that if you were a wealthy commoner, not if you are a noble, because if you were a noble, you had inherited your wealth, and you, in theory at least, managed it to the benefit also of your subjects, right? In the context of the feudal system, you were expected to give something to your subjects in terms, for example, of protection, health, in certain context. But more importantly, you had your wealth because that followed those plans. But what about the commoners? If you're a commoner and very wealthy, why were you wealthy? If you could have used your wealth to help the poor, why were you accumulating it? So for people like Thomas Aquinas, that wasn't any middle ground. If you are a wealthy commoner, you were a sinner, and your sin was avarice or greed, which is a very important sin, of course. And he went to the point of advising rulers to prevent their subjects from becoming involved in international trade, otherwise they would have become too rich, and that would have been polluting for society. Of course, the rulers didn't listen to him, right? He was discussing this issue precisely because the problem was arising, and it was arising from the commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th century, when certain places in Europe, many of them in Italy actually, started to expand international trade by using sea routes, beginning with the Mediterranean area and then integrating the Baltic area. Earlier phase compared to the beginning of the Atlantic. So he was observing the growing wealth of these commoners and he was condemning, but the process couldn't be stopped. To the point that by the end of the 15th century, as the presence of these very wealthy individuals could not be ignored, the reflection of wealth started to change, and in some functions, some roles to play for the rich were identified. So for people like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the rich had no place in a well-organized Christian society. The commoner rich. In the 15th century instead, and I'll make you Italian examples, but Italy was really, in the context of Europe, one of the places where the problem was arising. Humanists like Poggio Bracciolini at the beginning of the 15th century were arguing that the rich did play an important role, and basically they were like private parts of money. And he was saying, like, cities well organized, established public granaries to provide food in times of famine or crisis. We can't rely upon the rich during crisis to provide us with money. And the point is, during the crisis, we do ask the poor for help, they will not be able to help because they don't have anything to give. If we need money, they will not be able to help us. But the rich will be able to, willing or not. So an important thing here is that the simple fact of having the rich will allow, during a crisis, the community to ask them kindly to help, maybe to provide loans. If they don't want to provide loans, they will be forced to provide loans or they will be taxed. So it's not really a voluntary thing. And this is something that, by finding a role to play for the rich, so helping the communities in times of crisis, gives them an important role to play in society. The other function identified for the rich was that of magnificence. This is an idea that the Italian Renaissance takes straight from classical antiquity. Magnificence means to do great deeds. And this guy here, Giovanni Pontano, at the end of the 15th century says, in our age, from the 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Elder, was the first to revive the classical tradition of magnificence, which means changing private wealth into a public benefit. And the point here is that, even simply by building the palaces and villas, for example, these rich people are making the city splendid to the benefit of everybody, because you will enjoy aesthetically the palaces, those who come to your city will like it. When we go and visit an ancient city and we stroll along the roads and observe these palaces, we still enjoy them, so there is some merit in this idea. Even more if those people instead use their money, for example, to establish public libraries or to endow institutions like monasteries, or institutions like the poor, and so forth and so on. Now, we mentioned specifically Cosimo de' Medici. The point is, was Cosimo de' Medici magnificent? Well, simply based on what is left of the buildings he established and built, both his private buildings, but for example, he also established the first part of the Medici Library, which is considered to have been the first public library in Renaissance Europe. So he was magnificent. We still can, enjoy these places, which are usually museums today. But there is a but. So Cosimo is a very interesting case because he performed both the functions given to the rich. In 1433, he was exiled by his political enemies in Florence, which was a republic at the time, charged with intending to rise above the other citizens. And this means, intending to put an end to the republic, in fact. But the following year, as Florence had lost a war against Pisa, another small city, as they lost the war, they couldn't repay their war debt with the spoils of war, they called Cosimo back to help them, and at the same time, they exiled the political enemies of Cosimo. So they called him back and asked him if he could kindly save the city from financial ruin, which he does, by telling his bank to pay the loan of the city. So first function, help your community in times of crisis. Second function, from that moment on, he intensifies his magnificence. He endows monasteries, he builds villas, he establishes the library. But magnificence, again, doing great deeds, is not munificence, which means making gifts. It's not a gift, because this was clear, it was very clear to all the Florentine people in the time that by doing this, Cosimo was also making a very explicit claim, the claim to have a right to rule. In fact, 1434 is also considered the moment when the Medici family in Florence begins the so-called crypto-signory or hidden signory, which later will become formal signory, will become the Dukes of Florence. But from this moment, they are basically the ruler of what in theory is a republic, but in practice is ever more different from a republic. And that's the problem with magnificence, which also connects to pure and constance about what we today would call philanthropy. But philanthropy and giving, philanthropy in particular is a late 18th century concept. And philanthropy, to really be philanthropy, requires that nothing is given in exchange, not even simple influence. So the point here is that maybe some of what we tend to call philanthropy actually is magnificence. It would be better to call it magnificence because at least it's clear what's the bargain. Okay. Again, complex topic which I don't have the time to develop. Juliana stopped me when I told too much. Okay? I will skip the early modern period, which pains me. Now, main function of the rich, help the communities in times of crisis. The last case in which I could mention one super rich individual who saves his city from financial ruin is that of JP Morgan during the bank crisis of 1907. The famous story is that, faced with the risk of a run on banks, at the end of the weekend, he calls to his private library in New York, which, by the way, today is a museum, magnificent. A group of financiers from New York, and then he locks everybody in and tells whether we are not getting out of here until we have found a solution to the problem. So it's not only mobilizing his own capital, but also his connections. And when they get out of the library, they coordinate their action to restore faith in the solvability of financial system, preventing a run on banks. And JP Morgan, at that moment, is hailed by his fellow citizens as the savior of the countries, with words which are very similar to those used by the Florentines to welcome Cosimo de' Medici back to Florence in 1430. Problem is, this was a modern democracy. So this display of financial power in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century also fuels the concept of the time about the so-called money trust. So this group, very small group of extremely rich individuals who supposedly control the finances and the economy of the country, and that many risk, and this was a bipartisan worry, many fears, sorry, with a bipartisan worry, they might also try to control the politics. And, this is one episode which fuels this concern. This leads to the establishment of a committee, the Peugeot Committee, to investigate the money trust. This leads to the establishment, I think, in 1912, of the Fed system, which was aimed explicitly at preventing the country from having ever again to rely upon the goodwill of the rich to save from financial. At the same time, this becomes one additional motivation of the strengthening of antitrust legislation. Right? And this taps into that kind of big concentration of wealth, which we see in the United States and other Western countries, which follow the model of the United States regarding, for example, antitrust law. And this political concern, again, kind of fuels that process. Now, when with the very recent peak, what happens then during recent crises? Now, beginning with the Great Recession of 2008, then in Europe, the sovereign debt crisis of 2010-11, then the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen across the West repeatedly that people were asking for making the rich help more. In terms of fiscal innovation, this didn't lead to much, because we have surveys of fiscal reform across Western countries that show that very little was made in terms, for example, of introducing more progressive taxation or even adopt taxes of the rich, even on a temporary manner. And the net result of this is that if we compare the two last great financial crises, right, not the two last great, so these two great financial crises, the Great Recession of the 1930s, beginning with the 1929 stock market crash of Wall Street, and then the 2008 Great Recession, triggered by the financial crisis at the end of 2007, we observed after the first a decline in the wealth share of the richest, but not after the second. So the problem is, the wealth of the richest seems to have become ever more resilient to crises, but that resilience is also built on having avoided being made to help the communities in times of crisis. Now, this is not something that requires that all the rich and super rich are in agreement about trying to avoid being taxed. It's simply what comes from a prevalent, say, tendency, right? The point is, again, notwithstanding all these crises which provided all these good opportunities to make the rich perform their traditional social role, nothing happened. So they are not performing anymore this traditional social role. But that was what gave the rich a role to play in society at the end of the Middle Ages. And I would argue this is still an expectation we have, so they are no longer fulfilling this expectation, with potentially concerns in terms of social stability, in terms of future resilience against crises, and so forth and so on. I could develop this much more, but I talk too much, and I will stop here with anticipation of the cover of the future Spanish edition of the book, which will appear in October. Thank you. Talk too much, I apologize.